Hello, welcome to my channel. This is LON 3D, and today we're going to go over real-world scale for 3D modeling. So first things first, go to Edit and then Preferences and make sure that you have the Magic UV and the UV Toolkit add-ons installed. Next, take your model and make sure it is similar in size to the physical object it represents in the real world. Then press Ctrl A for Apply and apply the scale. So the scale values are all 1, 1, and 1 for the X, Y, and Z. Next, go into the UV editing workspace and make sure that your model is unwrapped. After your model is unwrapped, go to the Object Properties and under the UV Map section, add a new UV map and name it UV Real World Scale. After you have created your new UV map, make sure it is actively selected. Go into Edit Your Model, select everything, then go onto the UV Editor side of the screen and select everything again, and average the scale of all of the islands. Once that is done, on the 3D viewport side of your screen, hit the U key for the UV Unwrap options, go down to UV Manipulation and then World Scale UV and hit Apply Manual. In this menu, change the density to be equal to the texture size. So in this window, it's 1024 and hit OK. With that, your UVs are done, so we're going to move on to setting up the material. On your object, add as many material slots as you need for the textures that you're going to apply. This model only has 2 materials, a wood and a fabric. With the correct shader selected, add a UV map node, a mapping node, and any textures that will be applied for this material. In the UV map node, select your real world scale UVs, connect that to your mapping node, change the mapping node type from point to texture. Find the correct physical size for your textures, either from reference or match them by eye, and set that scale in the mapping node. Then connect the mapping node to your bitmap textures in the vector slot. Connect your textures to your shader, and then you're done. Now repeat this process for any materials that you need to set up for real world scale. The detailed walkthrough of this process is coming up next with some additional explanation about how to apply this workflow when you need custom masks or ID maps. Part of the reason I wanted to make this video is because when I originally was trying to apply for jobs in the 3D industry, one of the first jobs that I came across was for more of a model production position for ArcViz. And one of the job requirements was that you need to create a model using real world scale in 3ds Max. And I was like, okay, great, let's do this. I've never done real world scale before, but I know how to UV unwrap models and make materials. You know, how hard could it be to figure this out? So originally I learned how to do this process in 3ds Max, which it's not the easiest thing to do in 3ds Max without actually having additional plugins. If you've worked in Max before, you may be familiar with the UV tools. That's what I would recommend if you're trying to copy this process for 3ds Max. Otherwise, you'll be limited to some of the native UV unwrapping options, which it's one of the more basic modifiers where you can do like a box project, and then in that case you can enable real world scale, but then you don't have control over the UV seams, so it's not really great. But we're not going to be doing this process in 3ds Max. We're going to be doing it in Blender because it is possible in Blender as well, and the add-ons that you need to do it are free. So when you hear the term real world scale, or RWS, which I'm going to call it just so I don't keep getting tripped up over this long word, what does that mean when it comes to 3D modeling? You may not have heard this term before if you have only really been following game workflows, but it's a pretty common thing that you'll encounter if you are working for ArcViz applications or for product representation in general. So basically what real world scale is it's a way of working where the models and the materials that you make are based upon real world measurements. So their physical size of the model is the same as what you would see in real life, and then the physical size of the material measurement is also the same. So for this part, you may actually already be doing half of the process. If anytime you start a new model, you look up reference images, you look up reference dimensions, and as you're making that model, you start off with making a bounding box that represents the overall size of the model. If you're already doing that step, that's great. You're already half the way there. The only other part you have to do is to set up the model UVs and textures to also be real world scale. So, what are some benefits to using real world scale? Well, one of the things that you might have already deduced is that it is more accurate. So, if you have a material, say a fabric or a wood laminate of a certain size in real life, and you want to recreate that laminate exactly in 3D, by using real world scale, you can ensure that the laminate that you have created digitally is the same size as the laminate as it exists in real life. And then when that laminate gets applied to different models, it will be the same size consistently on those models as well, and the scale of it won't be changing unexpectedly. So even if you work on a modeling project at the beginning of the year and you use that laminate, when you work at a different modeling project at the end of the year, if you use that same exact laminate file, you won't have any discrepancy between those two models, even if you don't even have the original file anymore for the first model that you worked on. The other benefit of this is that sometimes it can help increase the resolution of the material that you're applying to a model, because it's not being baked down into a single map or a UDIM tile. If you say had two different couches and one is a small sofa and then the other one is a large sectional, the large sectional will still have the same fabric resolution as the small sofa, because it's not being constrained to UDIM tiles and it's not requiring that you do any sort of gymnastics to like bake that texture down and try to somehow unify the textile density across these two assets and create all these different texture sets and various things. So using real world scale can also simplify your process sometimes. And the plugins that we will need for today, there are two of them. The first one I would recommend just for ease of use, which is the UV toolkit. And then the other one that we must have for the real world scale sizing is Magic UV. So the way you can get those two UV plugins is to go to Edit and then Preferences, go to Get Extensions, and then if we type in UV, you should see some various options here. I already have Magic UV and UV toolkit installed, but if you don't have them, make sure you get those and then double check that they are enabled in your add-ons as well. All right, so to get started in our Blender scene here, I have just chosen a random chair model that I found on the Substance Source website, or I think it's called like Adobe Assets or something now. I don't remember. I'll put up the screenshots on the page so you can see which model I chose specifically. And this model was already sized to real world scale, but if you have a model of your own, just make sure that before you do anything else, you double check what the dimension should be by, you could just look up a similar item on Amazon or do a Google search and make sure that your model is sized to what it would be in real life. And if we go into our model here, make sure that you have also applied all of your transforms so that way you don't have any leftover scale on your model. So if you have a model and you have not yet UV unwrapped it, I recommend that you go ahead and do that. So this chair was already UV unwrapped. I just kind of cleaned up the geometry so it is separated according to what the materials are on each piece. So for this first object I have selected here, this is for the fabric, and then the second one is for the wood. Whenever you're working with real world scale materials, it's a lot easier to apply them if you can separate your mesh according to which material gets applied to that part of the mesh. You can do that either by separating the geometry or by separating the faces in selection mode and assigning them to their own material. There is also a third way that we're going to explore later, which is to create a custom mask to apply real world scale materials. So either way, you're going to need to make sure that your UVs are unwrapped and laid out correctly. And if we look here, we can see that together the wood and fabric UVs are just laid out in a single UDIB tile. This isn't the final configuration that we're going to need. We're going to have two. So we're going to have one that's like this, where they're like an atlas map. It doesn't have to be in a single UDIM tile, although it would make more sense for this type of workflow to just fit them in here because we're not too worried about the texture resolution that we're getting from this map. So everything here is all together. And the area where you'll need to double check and store your UVs is if you go to the Object Data tab and look here in the UV maps, we have UV Atlas here, or you might just have the standard Blender named UV map. I would recommend that once you've UV unwrapped everything that you go and rename it to something like UV Atlas, because that's going to be our 0 to 1 space. And then after we make our UV Atlas, what we are going to do is we are going to make our real world scale map. So I'm just going to delete this because it was from my testing earlier. And so to create our real world scale map, we can just click this plus icon here, and it's going to give us a new UV map. And right now with it selected, it's going to look exactly the same as the Atlas map we have up here, because it just creates a copy of whatever is already existing if there's something here, and just transports it to this new map. So with this new UV map selected, I'm just going to rename it first to UV_real world scale. The name convention doesn't matter, it's just as long as you can understand what it is. Now with our real world scale map selected, I'm just going to highlight everything in the viewport so I can highlight everything in the UV section here. And the first thing you're going to want to do is make sure that all of your UV island scales are the same size. So you don't want to have some item with a whole bunch of textile density and then another item that's really small. You are going to want to average the island scale. So I'm just going to bring up my search menu and then start typing in average and then average island scale. And that's great. We don't need to do anything else with it, but I'm going to just clean it up a little bit by packing the islands. So I'm going to search for pack islands. And then I don't want to scale or rotate anything. I just want to pack them to the closest UDIM. So that way they're a little bit cleaner to look at and not overlapping. When you're working with real world scale, it's actually okay if your UV islands are overlapping. And oftentimes that will happen intentionally if you want to move around an island because you want to change which part of the texture is showing up on that part of the furniture. So after you have averaged your island scale, now back in our 3D viewport, we're going to click the U key for the UV mapping menu. And then after you have enabled that magic UV add-on, you should have a new section called World Scale UV, and we're going to hit Apply Manual. Basically what we want to do to scale these UVs up to real world scale is just make sure that our density value here matches the texture size as listed here. The texture size doesn't really matter too much, so we can leave this at the default texture size of 1024, and I'm just going to change the density to also be 1024. And then the origin just determines where the UVs are being scaled from. So I'm just going to choose left bottom so they stay in the positive UV space. That doesn't really matter. That's just me being an organization freak. And then the area calculation is how it's determining the size of the UV islands. And we want it to take that measurement data from the mesh. So that's why it was important that we make sure our scale is applied. And we are going to hit OK. And now we can see that it has made our UVs a lot larger. One important thing to know is when you're trying to understand what the scale of your UVs are when it comes to real world scale sizing is that we're no longer thinking in just 0 to 1 space. So the single UV tile in Blender's default measurement of meters is also 1 square meter. And this may not be the same when you're working across different content creation packages. So, you know, the UDIM tile size that Blender has internally may not be the same as what it is in 3ds Max. So for textures that I create in Blender, the UV size often ends up being 10 times smaller than it is if I was doing the same exact process in 3ds Max, because my 3ds Max scene is set to centimeters. So if you are trying to, you know, work for a client or change between programs when you're doing this process, that may be something that you need to test ahead of time to see how the units are translating, because those UDIM tile sizes to determine that real world scale measurement may not be the same. So if I make this asset, for example, in Blender, but I know I have to make it for Max, which is using centimeters, I'm actually going to have to multiply the scale of my UVs by 100 for the material in Max to be the correct real world size when it gets applied to the Blender model. But for this, we're not going to worry about that too much, but I just wanted to put that in as a side note because that was an issue that I ran into in my own personal projects. Okay, so next, now that we have set up our model UVs, we are going to need to set up our materials to be real world scale as well. So here we are in our shading tab, and before I assign the individual materials to our chair, I have a single material applied to both of these pieces because I want to export this model to be able to make masks in Substance Painter as well. So just to avoid having the material split in Substance Painter, you want to make sure you have one material applied to everything before you export your FBX. So I have done that here. And then make sure before you export, just double check that you still have your Atlas map here on both pieces. I don't really know if it matters which one you have selected down here, but just select it just in case. And then I'm just going to select everything except for the chair parent and then export it to Substance Painter, and we will get back to this later. Now I'm going to select my fabric part here, and I'm just going to remove this chair atlas because we don't need it anymore. And I'm just going to add a material called fabric. And then for the wood, I'm just going to rename this to wood. Okay, so in case you didn't know, a lot of the materials on the Substance Source website, if you use Substance programs, are actually already scaled to be real world scale in most cases, or at least scaled to be approximately the correct size in the real world. If it's a scanned material, it's probably more likely to have an accurate sizing. So I'll just go through and put up the screenshots of the materials that I chose here. The wood turns out later to be more of like a generic scale I've found, so I end up changing the size later on. You know, depending upon what sort of reference you have for the project that you're doing, you may have an exact measurement that you can use for the texture that you're doing. So like if you have a laminate art file from like perhaps a vendor or that your company has made themselves, so you know what size it's supposed to be, then you can take those measurements directly from the file itself, and you don't have to worry about like manually creating the scale. But in a lot of cases, when you're creating real world scale materials, sometimes you'll have to create the initial material using reference where there is no scale provided, and for the first object that you're testing it on, you'll have to match it by eye, and that will determine what that real world scale is for that material then for all the other objects that it gets applied to. So sometimes you won't always have an exact measurement that you can use, and you'll just kind of have to match it manually using your best judgment. So to start off with, let's do the fabric because that one actually does have the correct measurements. And I've just exported the SBS AR file into flat tileable textures. And now is a good time to talk about the types of textures that work better with real world scale setup. So you can use textures that aren't tiling, so they don't have a repeat that's seamless. But it's going to make your life a lot harder because then when you place your texture onto the model, you're going to have to worry about where on the texture those UVs are falling to make sure that you don't accidentally put, you know, the seam of the texture in the middle of the face of an object or something, and you basically have to go through and hide them. So in most cases, you want your texture to be seamlessly tiling in both the horizontal and the vertical direction. But in some cases, there may be textures that are made to only tile in a single direction, so they may tile vertically but not horizontally, and those are okay too. Those are just a little bit harder to work with, so it all depends on, you know, what kind of situation you're in. But generally, tileable textures are easier to work with and are more desirable. So if you don't know how to use Substance Designer or make tileable textures in some other way, whether it's in Photoshop or whatever, you may want to get a little practice in doing that because it will make your life a lot easier, especially for making reusable materials. So more to come on that later, perhaps, I don't know. Okay, so I'm just going to bring in our fabric textures. And the first thing we're going to need to do is change the mapping for these textures. The mapping part of this is really important. If you don't do it right, then it's not going to work. So I will demonstrate with the albedo texture, but then this setup is going to be pretty much the same for all of the other textures, except for one mask that I'll go through at the end. And this will be another benefit of using real world scale textures, is you can make tiling repeats less obvious by having some of your real world scale textures be different scales than others, but I'll get more into that later. So first, for our fabric texture, I have the node wrangler installed, so I'm just going to hit Control-T to get a mapping and a texture coordinate node in here. If you don't have that, you can just search for a mapping node manually in here and add that to your scene. And I'm actually going to delete this texture coordinate because although this is often used with the mapping node, this is not actually what we want, because we need to pull the location data from the specific UVs that we've set up here in the UV map area. So it can't just pull from whatever UV map is randomly selected. So we're going to delete that and search for a UV map and add a UV map node. And now we're going to select our real world scale UV layout and connect this to the vector. And then the other thing we're going to do is we're going to change this mapping type from point to texture. So just a brief overview of these two different types. When the mapping coordinates are set to point, what they're doing is whenever they're changing the scale of your texture, they're doing it as if the UV size is being changed. So if you make the scale half the size, it'll be as if your UVs were made twice as large. Whereas if you're using the texture part of the mapping, whenever you make adjustments to your vector coordinates, it's as if you are changing the size of the texture instead. So the UVs stay the same. So if you were to make the texture size half as large, then it's as if the texture has been made half the size instead of changing the UV scales to be twice as large. And we need to know what's happening with our texture to figure out what the measurements are. So it's a lot easier to work with the texture type rather than the point, although you can use both. So we're going to set this to texture. And then for this fabric, we know that it is 2 meters. So here we have our scale and we want to set it so that way we know that our texture is also 2 meters. The scale here meaning that it's 1 meter, we're going to need to multiply this by 2 for 2 meters. And so if you had maybe a texture that was 75 centimeters, you would put 0.75 in here. You can basically just think of these measurements in here. Anything after the decimal point is centimeters. So this would be like 75 centimeters or 50 centimeters, 25, and then anything larger than a meter, 1.5 meters or 150 centimeters would be 1.5. So we want to use a value of 2 for 2 meters. And we make sure that this is connected to our texture, and then we connect our texture into the base color. And now we have it applied to the model at the scale that the material is in real life. And it's pretty much as simple as that. Now, say like you don't like the orientation of the stripes on the side. One of the things you can do when you're working in real world scale is adjust the orientation of your UVs. So let's just change this asset browser here to a UV editor, and we'll just select this whole piece. And so I know that this section here on the left is this trim here. And so if you want your texture to run in the other direction, you can just rotate your UVs in whatever direction makes the most sense. Oh, it actually was not. Oh, so here I've actually made a mistake. So you can see that I still had the UV atlas selected here. So I'm actually editing the wrong coordinates. So let's just undo that. And we'll just change to real world scale. And now when we go to edit this piece and rotate it 90 degrees, now it will change correctly. So just be aware of having the wrong UV set selected as you're making edits. Happens to the best of us. Okay, so you can edit the direction that your texture is showing up by doing that. So a lot of the time, one of the tips I like to give people is to always create your textures with any sort of grain direction running in the same direction. So at my workplace, whenever we're creating fabrics or woods and stuff, we always have the texture running vertically. So that way, whenever somebody's UV unwrapping a model, they know that the texture is going to be running vertically, so they can orient the UVs properly before they hand off the model to somebody else for materials, or just so they know ahead of time. So if the material isn't done yet, they don't have to guess and then, go back and revise the UVs a bunch of times because, the texture was facing in a different direction than they anticipated. So having a system can definitely be very helpful when doing this. All right, so now we've set that up for our fabric texture. So we can just connect these mapping coordinates to all of the other textures that need to align to create our material. So we can do it for our normal map and everything else. So I'm just going to do that now. Okay, so earlier I mentioned that sometimes you can improve the tiling effect of your material by having a map that is a different size. So we're going to go over that now. So here I've just added a sheen or like a fuzz effect to our fabric. And I want to add some variance in the sheen roughness, so that way it looks like maybe the fabric has been brushed or sat on or messed up a little bit, and so it all doesn't have the same sheen level when you're looking at it from, a particular angle. And so here I'm going to do that with our sheen roughness. And we can see here that our sheen roughness map is just a random grunge map, so it doesn't have any fiber details or other things that need to align with the other maps like the albedo or the normal. So we can basically make this map whatever scale that we want, and it doesn't have to conform to the same mapping that we've used for the rest of the material. So the way we can set this scale separately is we can duplicate this mapping node, and we'll still connect the same UV coordinates because we still wanted to use the real world scale layout that we've created, and connect this to the vector in here. And now we can change this scale to be whatever we want, and it won't break the other textures that we have connected. And to preview this, I'm just going to connect it to the base color so I can see what's happening. And so right now for a brushing effect, I feel like the scale of this is a little too large. So I'm actually going to change this to be tiling less. So we'll just say that 0.5 is a good value. And then I will reconnect this to the roughness and connect this back to the color. And so now we can see that we have some more variance in our brushing here. But the contrast is a little too high, so it kind of makes our chair look like it's dirty instead of, casually brushed or subtly brushed. So I'm just going to tweak this quickly with a color ramp, and then we'll be back on track. I'm just going to move this up and out of the way so it's not mixed in with everything else. Okay, so that's good enough for now. So next, let's move on to the wood. So I'm just going to repeat the same setup where I pull in the textures and then add the mapping nodes for these. Okay, so now we have our wood textures connected in here, and I'm just going to rotate it because the direction of the wood right now looks really unnatural. I'm just going to rotate that on the Z 90 degrees, which I don't love the way it looks on the arms, but this is just for the demo, so we're going to ignore it and pretend that it looks good. And right now, let's see. So according to the texture that was on the Adobe website, it said that it's 80 centimeters square, so I'm just going to put in that value to get us started with. And that doesn't look too bad, although I think that the scale of the wood looks a little bit too large. So if this was like the scenario where I had to adjust it by hand because I don't have an accurate measurement, this would be the way you would do it, where you would just go in and kind of look at the scale and say, okay, what value looks correct according to the reference that I have. And so we'll just say that a scale value of maybe 0.6 looks more accurate according to, what we're trying to go for. And that's got us set for the wood. Okay, so let's get into the scenario that we don't have this nicely divisible model where we can just easily select the parts that are supposed to be fabric or wood or a different material. Or maybe we have a situation where we want to use real world scale for our model, but then the model has some unique detail, like some sort of edge darkening or like an edge wear, a dirt pattern, something that you can't apply easily using this type of workflow where you just have a tiling texture, right? So there's different ways you can apply materials, and one of those includes by using masks. So this could be a mask that you generate in Blender itself, and then you use that to blend between the two different materials. Or maybe you don't have that option, or you need to do something that, is a little bit more complex. And so you want to create your mask in Substance Painter and then bring it back into Blender. So earlier we exported our model with a single material for Substance Painter. So let's get into how you would go about creating that mask in Substance Painter. And just as a reminder, that version of the model was exported with those Atlas UVs in the 0 to 1 space and not the UVs that are outside of it. So make sure that you definitely are using that version. Otherwise, you're going to have some weird issues in Substance Painter when you get there. So here we are in Substance Painter. I just have my chair in here. And just to confirm, this is the UVs where they're just in the single tile. And all I've done is it's just a standard shader. And I removed everything except for the base color because I'm just going to use that as a quick way to export a color map as a mask. And then in here, I've just baked some mesh maps using the chair as a high poly. So that way I can use some of the generators when I'm making the different masks to apply as an effect in Blender. But that's not necessarily a required part of this process. If you're hand painting something, you may not need to do that. So let's get into first how we would just assign materials. So you can do this if you only have 2 materials as just a grayscale black and white map. But if you have more than 2 materials, you're going to want to use an RGB map so you can store a grayscale map in each channel of your RGB map. So the red channel would be one mask, the blue channel would be a second mask, and the green channel would be a third mask. that you could then use to blend between those different materials. You could also try to do some sort of ID mask setup if you can separate the color channels or do some sort of like color picker in the program that you're bringing this into for like your final render. But to keep things simple, and especially if you're just doing this for the first time, I recommend only using a grayscale map or the RGB channels to contain 3 different grayscale maps. And you're not limited to a single mask map. You can kind of export as many as you want. So I'm going to demo how I did 2 different masks, one to separate the fabric from the wood, and then another one to apply just an edge darkening effect to the wood edges. So here we can see in our map 1 section that we have 2 different colors applied to our model. We have a red for the wood and we have a blue for the cloth. So it's pretty much as simple as this. I just made a new layer for each of these colors and then masked out using the mask tools each of the different sections of the model. So the wood and the fabric on their own color basically. And then I have exported that just using some simple output template where I'm just outputting the RGB channel from the base color as a texture that is named with a mask suffix, and it is just in an 8-bit PNG. And then once I exported it, I just renamed it. So if I export again, that original result doesn't get overwritten by the new result, which there's some better ways to set this up where you could, use the custom ID channels or something in Substance Painter and then set up a custom export thing to do this for you. But I don't want to get into the weeds of that right now. And just keep this as simple as possible. So we're just going to keep using the base color channel because that should work just fine for now. All right, so map number 2 is for our edge darkening effect. So here I have just made an edge darkening mask where the white indicates the areas of the edges that should be darkened. And all this is just a single white fill layer, and then I've added a black mask and just used a combination of a curvature generator and custom painting with some extra filters to basically just kind of create this slightly distressed edge wear, which you can see a little bit better in the mask isolation. And so I've just exported this as well and gotten this mask result. So now let's go back into Blender. So I'm just going to pretend as if we haven't separated these 2 parts of the model, right? And just join these together. So now we only have our 1 chair, and let's take everything from our wood setup and we're going to copy this and then paste it into our fabric material. And I'm just going to delete this wood material now. And then we're going to rename this to multi-material. So now in the bottom here, we have our wood. So I'm just going to rename this as wood. And then we have our fabric. And so how can we now combine these, which I'll just make sure this is assigned to everything. So how can we now combine these materials if per se we couldn't separate them manually on the mesh? Well, now we're going to import our mask that we baked out, which this is the red and blue mask, or whatever color you've chosen. I'm just going to take this and drag it and drop it in here and just change this to a non-color, just in case. It shouldn't matter too much. And now we are going to need to bring in a different mapping node because this mask isn't in real world scale. It's using our atlas layout. So let's get UV map, and we need a mapping node. And we're going to connect this to our vector and make sure that we have atlas selected this time. And connect this to our texture. And so now if we preview it, let's just make sure it's working. Okay, this is good. So all of the colors that we have assigned are appearing in the correct place. If they're not, make sure you've selected the correct UV map. And now we can separate the color in here to isolate our different masks. So we can get a separate color node and put our color in here. And now we can see that our wood is isolated in the red channel, green has nothing, and then blue is our fabric. So if we do a mix shader node, well, now we know our fabric is first and our wood is in the red channel. So our red channel is going to be the mask for the second slot here. So the fabric will go in first. And if we connect this to our output so we can see what's happening, so that means that our wood, once we plug it in, will show up in the correct spot. This is the way we can apply real world scale materials at the same size using a custom mask. And similarly, now we want to add our edge darkening effect onto our wood. So we're going to take this same setup here, and we're going to open our second mask that we exported. Connect this in here, change the color space to non-color because it's a mask. And now we can do a mixed color node for our wood material. So the first color is just going to be the standard wood. And then say we want to darken the edges. So we'll just say that this is multiplying to make the thing darker. And then we'll use the color output from our mask because it's white to dictate where the edge darkening goes in this multiply and connect it to our base color. And now we can see, if we just turn this on and off, that now using the mask, we are applying edge darkening to our wood, and we are still able to maintain all of the details of that correctly sized material by utilizing our different UV sets for this. All right, so I hope this real world scale was tutorial. This real world scale was tutorial. All right, so I hope this real world scale tutorial was helpful for you in your workflow. If you have any extra questions about something that I showed in the tutorial, or any questions about 3D modeling in general, feel free to leave it down in the comments below, and I will see you next time.